Okay, thank you for hanging in on this. I'll try to be as brief as I can. This is hard stuff. There are extremes on all sides. I think we have to be honest about that. A colleague of mine says, what are you going to do if you think Julius Caesar's the despot? Get rid of the month of July. You know, and when is it going to stop? We have to be cognizant of the fact that we're rational creatures. There are lots of complaints about the abuse of Title IX. I think the lawsuit filed against Lord Kipnis was completely wrong-headed and destructive. And yet, we have to remember that it's easier to get expelled from college for plagiarism than it is for rape. Okay, we have to put this into perspective. I'm adamantly against making speech illegal, but there's a huge gray area just short of that that has become fixated upon in order to discredit and delegitimize, ironically, not only speech but also behavior that disturbs us. So there's a lot that's going on here. I want to be very specific and practical here. No highfalutin comments about ideals and justice and freedom. My comments will be disappointingly pedestrian. Nothing at all sensationalistic or sexy, alarming, or disgusting. Sorry.
An anti-trigger warning.
Exactly, a dull warning. Instead, I want to argue for what human rights activist, attorney, and law professor Brian Stevenson calls proximity. What he means by that is not standing aloof and in judgment, but trying to get closer to what actually drives injustice, damages peoples, causes pain and anger, and bad speech, rather than condemn people from afar, reducing them to being simply bad examples of bad things. My hypothesis is that what we are witnessing today is the outcome of demographic shifts and historical contingency colliding with the very good ideals of American education. Let's remember that the ethos of American higher education is uniquely tied to the goal both of just inventing citizens, which is uniformly across Western democracies, but also in America for social mobility, inclusion, and enfranchisement. So what happens when it's successful? When people who do not look or act necessarily think like us, and furthermore do not necessarily want to be like us or have our dreams, actually arrive on campus, and in greater and greater numbers. We are going to have very soon more and more majority-minority campuses. It has a profound effect on higher education. The United States Supreme Court affirms the value of diversity, not because of any highfalutin ideals, but because of the practical needs of students to be able to negotiate an increasingly diverse and globalized world. When we fought for the famous Western Civ thing at Stanford, our allies at Stanford for reforming the curriculum were not the humanities, they were the worst. The best allies were the med school, the law school, and the business school because they understood the practical value of learning from other people. Okay, so we have a contradiction. Mobility, enfranchisement, inclusion, democratization, but only, it seems, if you're willing to become what we want you to become. On our terms, we talk about students taking agency. When we do, we get really pissed off if they're not doing it in the way we want them to do. According to our conventions of behavior and decorum, what happens when we have too much diversity, too much what I call insistent difference, or what might be called integrity, and the insistence with regard to too much democracy? When we are forced to acknowledge that we are restricting speech by insisting it conform to our notions of civility and proper address. Let's be more specific. Let's talk about students calling professors out when they make sexist, racist, transphobic speech. I'm taken aback when people do that to me. The famous blog on Vox, I'm a liberal professor, I'm terrified by my liberal students. What a whiner, come on, guy. Let's get real. Who's in power here? We award the grades, we call them to our office hours when we're ever damn ready to have them, right? I think that's a really weird way of talking about students as college. Professors are way more college than students. When students call me out, I'm of course dismayed and hurt, but mostly I think I'm not doing my job. I'm not being an effective teacher. Somehow, what I'm trying to convey to them is not communicating to them in the way that they need to be communicated with, and rather than hold back from them, I want to learn from them. I'll give you one example, it was referred to earlier. I taught a course last year called Ferguson in the Global Frame. It was trying to teach students about human rights via the actually existing episode unfolding in Ferguson and showing issues of police brutality, freedom of speech, etc., globally, Brazil, France, the UK. First day of class, first week of class, first 2 weeks of class, everybody was totally on board. Yay, human rights, the weapon of the weak. There was no dissent there. It was predominantly African-American students. Everything was fine, almost eerily fine. Last day of class, that episode that was alluded to earlier today. What happened at the University of Oklahoma, right? A bunch of kids go out in a private car to a graduation party. The guys sing this obnoxious song about lynching the N-word. It's captured on YouTube. By the time they get back to campus, the president has expelled them. I asked my students, well, what do you think about that? They said, finally a white male president does something right about racism. And they went on and on about how great it was. I said, fine, is that really all you have? And they said, yes. And I said, well, what about freedom of speech? What about freedom of assembly? What about right to privacy? What about due process? We had an interesting, very heated, very abrasive discussion. At one point, near the end, the student slapped the table and said, if this is what this is about, then fuck human rights. There was a pause in the conversation as I regrouped. The fear and anger I saw in their eyes was probably reflected in mine. And what I said at that point was, good, we finally stopped bullshitting each other, right? That abrasion, that rudeness was fundamentally important. And then I said, the final's due in a week. You have an extra assignment, and you can do it if you want. You can do the regular final if you want to. Write on what just happened, and tell me why human rights come up deficiently. And I got some of the most brilliant essays I've ever gotten. One that I'll share with you was, human rights fall short because they cannot take adequate account of history. Isn't that cool? I don't know whether it's right or not. I'm not a human rights expert. But the person had thought, and it wasn't because of, if I said there would be trigger warnings, then that would have been absent. So I'm not for that, but I'm also not for imagining that students can't speak up and force me to be a better teacher. We've already talked about how the whole idea of coddled kids is kind of phony. I've had a student, we have a thing at Stanford where the parents drop off their darling ones as they go into the mob, the beast. And they get to have lunch with the president. It's a big deal. First generation kid, migrant farm worker, her family was only able to drop them off because she was going down to Gilroy to harvest artichokes. Her family was, right? They can't take place in any of that. Transgender people being beaten near an inch of their life. These are not frivolous, made-up, hypersensitive students. These are key parts of their experience. They would welcome, recruit people on diversity. And then we say, shut up when they actually express themselves. More generally, suicide is the second highest cause of death on college campuses. The suicide rate on colleges has tripled since 1952. The leading cause of death on college campuses is this amorphous category called accidents, which covers substance abuse, alcoholism, and depression. Students graduate, the average debt load of students graduating from the university is $29,000. Remember that student loans cannot be forgiven. They cannot be walked away like a bad mortgage. They stay with you for the rest of your life. Most students will probably never own a home. They are not coddled. I would argue they're brutalized. And they're also brutalized because they can't take the courses they want. The crash of '08 has monetized higher education. People talk, oh, students want demands and they're consumers and they just want to be treated. Of course, they want some purchase power on the debt that they've just taken on. So they can't take courses in the humanities. They're considered luxuries. They can't explore exactly what universities are for. I don't call that coddling. I call that limiting and constraining in a horrible way. Okay, what do students want? I'm finishing up now. Look at the data. A study was done of the 15 top demands of the students who were protesting Yale, Harvard, etc. Top of the list, a more diverse faculty, a wider curriculum. Third on the list, more hard empirical data on racism. Against the image of students as being coddled, emotional, trigger happy, they wanted more data, what most administrators would want. Bottom of the list, restrictions on free speech or speech codes. That was the bottom, okay? Finally, what I want to drive home now as I end this commentary, make no mistake about it. Grossly undercovered by the press is the real threat on campus to freedom of speech are from external actors with real political and financial power who are interfering with administration and faculty governance. Talked about pampered students. There have been a number of frivolous lawsuits filed under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act saying that Jewish students are unfairly harmed, emotionally damaged by protests critical of the state of Israel. Every single one of those at the college level has been thrown out. The Department of Education's memo to UC Berkeley says a college student should expect to be challenged. Exactly what Brandon is talking about. Expect to be challenged. Why is it so selectively aimed at women and minorities and not the full panoply of students who are coming up with these complaints? And exactly who's filing these suits? It's not them, it's rather external agents. The case of Stephen Saleta is well known. I'll give you one more and then I'll end. It has to do with California. And Professor Medici alluded to it earlier. It was House Combined Resolution 35. It started out as a bill that was introduced to try to enshrine in California law and in the UC system the United States Department definition of anti-Semitism. There was a lot of blowback because it basically said, as Medici said, that any criticism of the state of Israel should be considered anti-Semitic. Okay? Now, importantly,
Not true.
it is true. You read the it's not true at all. You read the legislation. Look at the EU document. The author of the EU document upon which the United States State Department definition is premised said, as much as he stood by the statement, he said he abhorred the notion it would be applied on college campuses. So he made a very clear distinction about where he wanted that applied. It's an op-ed, you can look it up. It's very easy to find. What's happened is that there was sufficient pushback, so it was modified to be what was called a tolerance bill. Okay? Tolerance, anti-bigotry, et cetera, uniformly. That was fine. But the regents, especially one regent, Richard Bloom, has decided, no, he wants to go back to the anti-Semitic definition. And he said, there's going to be severe consequences on the UC system if this doesn't go through, because my wife is going to weigh in. Anybody know who Richard Bloom's wife is? Dianne Feinstein. Calling the US Senate in to interfere with the University of California's business, to me, is a much more egregious issue. I'm much more worried about those with real wealth, political power, who seek to impede and interfere with the academic mission of the university, rather than a group of vocal students who are actually challenging us to be more efficient teachers in a world unlike the one that we grew up in, and thereby actually aid the university in maintaining its mission, perhaps despite itself. Thank you.